why the Byzantine army rebelled against Emperor Maurice. In the final months of the year 602, a Roman army waited near the lower Danube as winter approached. The campaigning season had already been long. Men had marched through forests, crossed rivers, pursued Slav raiders, guarded supply lines, and watched horses weaken under the strain of repeated operations. The soldiers expected the familiar end of the season. A return to safer territory south of the river, the repair of weapons, shelter from the cold, care for exhausted animals, and perhaps a brief opportunity to see families or attend to private affairs. Then an order arrived from Constantinople. Emperor Maurice commanded the army to remain beyond the Danube and continue operations through the winter. To the emperor, the order may have represented a rare strategic opportunity. Winter exposed enemy settlements, reduced the protection offered by forests, froze rivers and marshes, and made movement easier in places that were nearly impossible to cross during warmer months. To the soldiers, however, the command carried a different meaning. It meant cold, hunger, uncertain supplies, damaged horses, no rest, and another season of danger under an emperor already known for strict financial discipline. The men protested. Their commander, Peter, was Maurice's own brother. They expected him to understand that the order could not be carried out safely. He refused to abandon it. The protest became organized resistance. Representatives were chosen. Officers lost control. A relatively obscure centurion named Phocas emerged as a spokesman. Within weeks, the mutiny moved south. Within days of losing Constantinople, Maurice was captured with his family. His sons were killed before his eyes, and then the emperor himself was beheaded. The rebellion began with a dispute over winter quarters. It ended with the destruction of a dynasty, the rise of a usurper, a new war against Persia, and the collapse of years of Roman military success in the Balkans. The great question is not simply why the soldiers disliked one order. It is how an experienced army came to believe that overthrowing its emperor was safer than obeying him. The answer lies in 20 years of war, money, mistrust, exhaustion, political division, and the failure of a capable ruler to understand how deeply his soldiers had come to resent him. The empire Maurice ruled did not call itself Byzantine. That name was created by later historians. Maurice, his officials, and his soldiers considered themselves Romans. Constantinople was the capital of the Roman Empire, and the emperor claimed to continue the authority of Augustus, Constantine, and Justinian. By the late 6th century, the empire still controlled vast territories. Asia Minor provided manpower and revenue. Egypt supplied grain. The Balkans protected the approaches to the capital. Imperial provinces remained in North Africa and parts of Italy. Islands and ports linked the Mediterranean. Yet the size of the empire was also a burden. Every frontier demanded soldiers, money, fortifications, transport, and diplomacy. In the east, the Roman state faced the powerful Sasanian Persian Empire. In the Balkans, the Avars had created a formidable steppe confederation, while numerous Slav groups crossed the Danube to raid, settle, and retreat through difficult terrain. In Italy, the Lombards continued to expand. In the Mediterranean, fleets and garrisons had to be maintained. The government could not abandon any frontier without risking a political humiliation or strategic disaster. The Danube was especially important. It was not merely a river separating two worlds. It was a defensive system, a transport route, and a symbol of Roman order. Fortresses guarded crossings, roads connected military bases, ships moved supplies and troops. If hostile groups crossed in strength, they could reach Thrace, Macedonia, Greece, Dalmatia, and the roads leading toward Constantinople. The empire needed armies that could move rapidly, operate in forests and marshes, and remain in the field for long periods. That requirement was expensive. Soldiers needed regular pay, food, clothing, horses, weapons, tents, medical care, and opportunities to replace damaged equipment. Commanders needed intelligence, engineers, transport animals, boats, and fortified camps. Diplomacy required gifts and payments to foreign rulers. When the government lacked money, it could not simply stop paying. Unpaid soldiers became dangerous. Abandoned fortresses invited invasion. Reduced rations weakened discipline. Every financial decision therefore carried military consequences. Maurice inherited this impossible balance. He came to the throne in 582 after the death of Tiberius II, an emperor remembered for generosity but also for spending heavily. Maurice received an empire that needed constant defense but did not possess unlimited resources. His response was discipline, calculation, and economy. Those qualities helped him preserve the state, but they also created the reputation that would destroy him. Maurice had not risen to power as an idle court aristocrat. He had served in the imperial administration and gained experience in war. During the conflict with Persia, he commanded Roman forces and developed a reputation for competence. Tiberius II selected him as successor and arranged his marriage to the emperor's daughter Constantina. When Maurice became emperor, he brought the habits of a military planner into the palace. He understood that victory depended on preparation, intelligence, logistics, discipline, and the correct use of terrain. A military handbook known as the Strategicon has traditionally been associated with his name. Scholars debate whether Maurice personally wrote it, commissioned it, or simply ruled in the environment that produced it. Whatever the exact authorship, the work reflects the strategic culture of his reign. It discusses formations, scouting, camps, cavalry, supply, seasonal warfare, and the different habits of enemy peoples. It treats war as a practical science. An emperor who thought in this way could see winter not only as suffering but as opportunity. He could calculate that frozen rivers would aid movement, that enemy communities would be easier to locate, and that continued pressure might prevent another year of raids. Maurice's strengths were real. He was serious, experienced, and capable of long-term planning. He helped stabilize the eastern frontier by intervening in a Persian civil war and restoring Khosrow II to the Sasanian throne. The settlement that followed gave the Romans favorable conditions and allowed Maurice to transfer attention toward the Balkans. His armies achieved notable victories against the Avars and Slavs. By the end of his reign, Roman forces were campaigning north of the Danube, striking enemy settlements and attempting to restore the frontier. Yet the same qualities that made Maurice a strong strategist made him a difficult political leader. He expected sacrifice because he believed the survival of the empire required it. He attempted to control expenditure because he knew that money wasted in one region could cause disaster in another. He trusted systems, commands, and calculations. What he did not always understand was the emotional relationship between emperor and army. Soldiers did not judge policy only by strategic results. They judged whether the emperor respected them, paid them fairly, protected their families, and recognized the hardships of service. Maurice repeatedly made decisions that could be defended on paper but appeared cruel in practice. Over time, the army stopped interpreting his orders as difficult necessities. It began to interpret them as evidence that the emperor valued money more than the men who fought for him. Military pay was more than a salary, it was a political bond. The emperor promised compensation, recognition, and protection. In return, soldiers accepted discipline and the possibility of death. Cash supported families, purchased equipment, maintained animals, and gave men a measure of independence. When an emperor attempted to reduce or control that compensation, soldiers could view the act as a violation of trust. Maurice learned this early. In the late 580s, while the empire was still fighting Persia, the government attempted to reduce expenditure on the Eastern Army. The measure contributed to serious unrest. Soldiers rejected commanders, challenged authority, and demonstrated that military reforms could become political crises. The empire survived that earlier mutiny, but the warning was clear. An army under pressure would not calmly accept every financial decision from Constantinople. Later, Maurice attempted to provide parts of military compensation in the form of clothing, equipment, or other goods rather than cash. From the government's perspective, the reform made sense. Soldiers were supposed to use allowances to maintain readiness. Direct distribution could ensure that they actually possessed the required items, reduce waste, and control prices. From the soldiers' perspective, the policy reduced their freedom and possibly their income. Goods supplied by officials might be poor in quality, overpriced in the accounts, or unsuitable for individual needs. Cash could support a family or repair equipment locally. A state-issued cloak could not. Even when the reform was modified or abandoned, the memory remained. Maurice became known as an emperor who looked for ways to save money on his troops. Once such a reputation forms, every later order is interpreted through it. A command to winter beyond the Danube could therefore sound like a plan to avoid paying for winter quarters and supplies. Maurice may have believed the order was strategically necessary. The army suspected that the real goal was economy. Later, chroniclers strengthened this image with stories about Roman prisoners captured by the Avars. According to one moralizing tradition, Maurice refused to pay a ransom, and thousands of captives were massacred. The sources are contradictory, and modern historians question whether the event happened in the dramatic form later writers described. Yet historical truth and political reputation are not always the same. Soldiers did not need reliable documentation. They needed only to believe that the emperor had allowed comrades to die rather than spend imperial gold. Such a story could spread through camps, taverns, families, and veterans' communities. Whether accurate or exaggerated, it expressed what many already feared, that Maurice's calculations had no room for human mercy. The army's resentment did not develop in isolation from the hardships of Balkan warfare. Campaigning near and beyond the Danube was exhausting. The landscape included forests, marshes, rivers, and settlements that could be abandoned before Roman forces arrived. Slav groups did not always fight in the manner expected by Roman armies. They could disperse, hide, ambush small units, cross water, and reappear elsewhere. The Avars possessed cavalry, diplomatic skill, and the ability to coordinate different peoples. Roman soldiers marched long distances, built camps, guarded baggage, crossed dangerous rivers, and searched for enemies who rarely offered a simple, decisive battle. Success often meant burning settlements, capturing prisoners, seizing food and forcing hostile groups away from the frontier. These operations could produce booty, but they also wore down men and animals. Horses were especially important. Cavalry remained central to Roman warfare. A weakened horse reduced a soldier's usefulness and could ruin him financially. Fodder was difficult to obtain in winter. Animals already exhausted by summer and autumn campaigning needed rest. Weapons and armor also required maintenance. Leather cracked, metal rusted, clothing wore out, and tents deteriorated. Winter quarters were therefore not a luxury. They were part of the military cycle. The army could recover, replace equipment, reorganize units, and prepare for the next season. Maurice's plan threatened that expectation. The men would remain in hostile territory, possibly live from local resources, and continue operations when they believed the campaign should end. They had also acquired booty. Carrying it into another phase of war exposed it to loss. Booty was not merely greed, it was part of the reward system of ancient campaigning. A soldier who had survived dangerous operations expected to keep what he had earned. The order also threatened leave. Some soldiers may have hoped to return to families, farms, or local communities during the winter. Others needed time to settle debts or repair private equipment. The command suggested that military service had no clear boundary. One campaign would flow into another without rest. Maurice saw pressure against the enemy. The soldiers saw an emperor extending hardship indefinitely. The specific winter strategy was not irrational. In fact, it may have been militarily intelligent. Winter changed the environment north of the Danube. Forests lost leaves, reducing concealment. Snow could reveal tracks. Marshes and smaller rivers might freeze, creating routes that did not exist in warmer months. Enemy groups depended on seasonal movement and dispersed settlements. If Roman armies attacked during the period when communities expected relative safety, they could destroy supplies, capture leaders, and prevent raiders from regrouping. Continued pressure might also demonstrate that the Danube was no longer the limit of Roman action. Maurice had reason to believe that the empire possessed momentum. During the 590s, Roman commanders won important victories. The Avar Federation suffered losses. Roman forces operated beyond the river and threatened areas that had previously served as safe bases for raids. Some subject groups within the Avar world showed signs of discontent. A determined winter campaign might have strengthened Roman control and reduced attacks in future years. Maurice's order, therefore, may have represented the final stage of a larger strategy. He was not necessarily sacrificing an army for a small financial saving. He may have believed he was close to securing the Balkans. But strategy exists only through people. An order that makes sense at the imperial level can collapse if the soldiers expected to carry it out no longer trust the ruler. Maurice failed to persuade the army that the danger served a larger purpose. He communicated through Peter, a commander whose position as the emperor's brother made him appear to represent the palace rather than the men. The troops were not invited into the logic of the plan. They received a command. Because of Maurice's reputation, they interpreted that command as another attempt to reduce the cost of maintaining them. A strategically sound campaign became politically impossible. This was the tragedy at the center of the rebellion. Maurice may have been correct about the enemy and wrong about his own army. He understood the seasonal weakness of the Slavs better than he understood the accumulated anger of Roman soldiers. There had already been a warning. In 593, Maurice had attempted a similar policy, ordering troops to remain or operate north of the Danube during winter. The commander Phocas did not fully enforce the emperor's wishes. He adapted to the soldiers' resistance and avoided turning the disagreement into a struggle for the throne. That earlier episode created an expectation. The army learned that a commander could negotiate, delay, or disobey an order considered too dangerous. Maurice learned a different lesson. He may have concluded that the strategy remained correct and that failure resulted from insufficient discipline. When the issue returned in 602, the commander was Peter. Peter was not simply another general, he was Maurice's brother. His family connection increased the political pressure on him to obey. It also reduced his credibility with the troops. A commander who opposed the emperor could claim to represent field experience. A brother who opposed the emperor risked appearing disloyal to his own dynasty. Peter refused to cancel the order. The soldiers initially attempted to persuade him. This is important because it suggests that the rebellion was not planned from the beginning as a coup. The men wanted relief, not necessarily revolution. They expected Peter to act as Phocas had acted. He did not. The disagreement hardened. The army began to organize. Men were chosen to represent the grievances of the units. The soldiers challenged their officers and refused movement. Weather may have briefly created uncertainty, with some considering whether the command could still be obeyed. But the possibility faded. The mutiny became public and collective. Once soldiers openly rejected an imperial order, they faced a new danger. Even if Maurice later withdrew the command, the leaders could be punished for disobedience. Units could be broken apart. Officers could be executed. Pay could be withheld. A mutiny creates momentum because compromise becomes less safe after every step. The soldiers may initially ask only for better conditions. Once they have threatened commanders and elected representatives, they must also protect themselves from revenge. Removing the emperor can begin to appear safer than trusting his forgiveness. Among the representatives chosen by the soldiers was Phocas. Before the revolt, he was not one of the empire's great generals. He did not possess the prestige of a victorious commander or the blood of an imperial dynasty. Later, hostile writers would describe him as ugly, brutal, ignorant, and drunken. But those portraits were shaped by the regime that eventually overthrew him. What mattered in 602 was that Phocas emerged from the army itself. He could speak for men who believed senior officers had ignored them. He represented protest rather than palace authority. The soldiers raised him on a shield, a traditional sign of military acclamation. Yet even then, the army did not immediately decide that Phocas must become emperor. The rebels considered alternatives with stronger legitimacy. Maurice's eldest son, Theodosius, might replace his father while preserving the dynasty. Germanus, connected to the imperial family through marriage, also possessed political importance. Other senior figures may have been discussed. This shows that the mutiny's first political objective was not necessarily the extermination of Maurice's family. Many soldiers could imagine a corrected monarchy rather than a completely new regime. If Theodosius accepted their grievances and distanced himself from his father's policies, the army could claim it remained loyal to the imperial house, but dynastic solutions required cooperation from elites in Constantinople. Candidates hesitated, court factions maneuvered. Maurice suspected betrayal. The capital's political divisions made every negotiation dangerous. As uncertainty continued, focus became more important. The soldiers trusted the spokesman they had chosen. He had no independent power base that could easily ignore them. His future depended on the success of the rebellion. For mutineers afraid of punishment, such dependence was attractive. An aristocratic emperor might reconcile with Maurice's supporters and sacrifice the leaders of the revolt. Phocas could not survive without the army. He therefore became the candidate most likely to protect it. The rebellion would not have succeeded if Constantinople had remained united behind Maurice. The capital, however, was already unstable. Earlier in 602, food shortages had produced public anger. Egypt's grain supply was essential to Constantinople, and disruptions quickly affected prices and availability. Crowds insulted the emperor. During a religious procession, Maurice faced hostility serious enough to require protection. Military victories far away did not feed hungry residents. The emperor's careful finances looked different from the streets than they did in the palace. To officials, thrift preserved the treasury. To citizens, it could appear that the government demanded sacrifice while failing to provide food. Maurice's administration was associated with unpopular financial officials, including Constantine Lardes. Such men became symbols of imperial harshness. The circus factions, especially the blues and greens, were also politically important. They were not merely supporters of competing teams in the hippodrome. They could organize neighborhoods, express public anger, and attach themselves to rival elites. Their loyalties shifted according to opportunity and grievance. The arrival of a rebellious army therefore interacted with a capital already divided by hunger, factional rivalry, and court suspicion. News from Constantinople likely reached the Danube. Soldiers could hear that Maurice had been insulted, that the population was restless, and that powerful men might accept a change of emperor. This information altered the risk of rebellion. A mutiny against a beloved ruler protected by a loyal capital would be suicidal. A march against an unpopular emperor in a divided city might succeed. Political opponents also recognized opportunity. The army's grievances could be used to weaken Maurice. Urban factions could present themselves as defenders of the people. Members of the elite could negotiate with the rebels while denying responsibility. The movement that began near the Danube was therefore transformed by the politics of the capital. Soldiers supplied force. Constantinople supplied legitimacy, information, and division. Maurice attempted to respond, but his decisions revealed how isolated he had become. He sent messages, considered concessions, and tried to manage rival candidates. Theodosius and Germanus became objects of suspicion. At one point, Germanus sought sanctuary in a church after fearing arrest. Crowds and factions gathered. Rioting spread. Maurice could no longer be certain which guards, officials, or citizens would obey him. The palace remained physically powerful, but political authority had weakened. An emperor rules not only through walls and soldiers, but through the expectation that resistance will fail. Once that expectation disappeared, the dynasty collapsed quickly. The rebel army advanced toward Constantinople. Maurice prepared defenses, but also sought escape. On the night of November 22nd, 602, he fled across the Bosporus with members of his family. The decision was understandable. Remaining in the capital risked immediate assassination. Reaching the Asian side might allow him to contact loyal commanders, gather forces, or seek support from Khosrow II in Persia. Maurice had once helped restore Khosrow to the Persian throne, and the king owed him a political debt. Yet flight also surrendered the symbolic center of the empire. On November 23rd, Phocas was proclaimed emperor at the Hebdomon, a military and ceremonial site outside Constantinople. 2 days later, he entered the capital. The speed of the transition shows that Maurice's authority had already disintegrated. The army that had refused winter service now possessed the throne. Crowds welcomed the new ruler, perhaps expecting relief from taxes, punishment of officials, and an end to unpopular policies. Phocas presented himself as the answer to military and urban grievance. The empire had changed emperors in less time than many soldiers needed to march from one frontier fortress to another. Maurice's flight did not save him. He and his family were captured near Chalcedon on the Asian shore of the Bosporus. Phocas could not safely allow the former emperor and his sons to live. A surviving dynasty would attract conspiracies. Theodosius, in particular, had already been considered as an alternative ruler. Loyalists could rally around him. Khosrow II could use Maurice or one of his sons as a reason to intervene. The new regime, therefore, chose extermination. The former emperor and several of his sons were taken near the harbor of Eutropius. Byzantine tradition describes the execution as an act of calculated cruelty. Maurice was forced to watch his sons killed one by one before he was beheaded. Later writers present him as accepting the horror with religious resignation. Some record a prayer acknowledging divine justice. Such details may have been shaped by the desire to turn Maurice into a martyr and Phocas into a monster. The central event, however, is not seriously doubted. The sons were executed, and Maurice died after them. Their heads were displayed to the army or public. The bodies were thrown into the water before being recovered and buried. Theodosius may have escaped briefly or been sent on a mission before he was captured and killed. Conflicting rumors later claimed that he survived, and those rumors became useful to enemies of Phocas. Maurice's wife Constantina and his daughters were initially spared and confined. Their survival did not last. After another alleged conspiracy, they too were executed. The imperial family was systematically removed. The mutiny that began with complaints about horses, supplies, and winter quarters had become the massacre of children and women. This transformation reveals how political violence expands. The original grievance may be limited. Once a new ruler takes power through rebellion, everyone connected to the old regime becomes a possible threat. The logic of security demands more blood. The image of Maurice watching his sons die became central to the moral memory of the coup. Later, chroniclers wrote under rulers who had defeated Phocas and needed to justify another rebellion. They portrayed Maurice as a lawful emperor punished by a brutal usurper. This does not mean the execution was invented. It means that the way it was narrated served political purposes. Theophylact Simocatta, one of the most important historians of Maurice's reign, wrote under Heraclius, the emperor who overthrew Phocas in 610. Heraclius's government benefited from presenting Phocas as a tyrant and Maurice as a victim whose memory deserved restoration. The historian emphasized Maurice's virtues, military achievements, and tragic end. He had less reason to explore the legitimate grievances of the soldiers who first rebelled. Modern history must therefore hold two realities together. Maurice was brutally executed, and his family suffered an appalling destruction. At the same time, the army's grievances did not begin as fictional propaganda. Soldiers had experienced years of financial reforms, exhausting campaigns, difficult commanders, and uncertain support. Phocas did not create their anger from nothing. He emerged because the imperial system had failed to resolve it. Condemning the massacre should not erase the conditions that made rebellion possible. Understanding those conditions does not excuse the killing of Maurice's children. Historical explanation and moral judgment are not the same. One can recognize that Maurice made serious political mistakes and still condemn the violence that ended his dynasty. Phocas now ruled an empire that had not solved any of the problems behind the revolt. The treasury remained limited. The frontiers remained dangerous. Soldiers still needed pay and supplies. Food still had to reach Constantinople. The new emperor depended on the Balkan army and urban factions that had elevated him. He could not easily demand the same sacrifices Maurice had demanded without appearing to betray the rebellion. His legitimacy was fragile because he lacked dynastic connection and broad elite support. Conspiracies followed. Officials were removed, punished, or executed. Later sources describe a reign of terror, though the intensity of that portrait reflects hostile memory. Phocas faced the impossible task of turning a military protest into stable government. He had gained power because different groups opposed Maurice, not because those groups shared a long-term program. Soldiers wanted improved conditions. Urban crowds wanted food and relief. Elites wanted influence. Factions wanted advantage. Once Maurice was gone, their interests separated. The new emperor's greatest danger came from Persia. Khosrow II had been restored to the Sasanian throne with Maurice's assistance during a Persian civil war. He could now claim to avenge his benefactor. He also had strategic reasons to exploit Roman instability. Persian forces invaded Roman territory. The conflict that followed became far larger than earlier frontier wars. Cities fell. Provinces were devastated. Under Heraclius, the struggle would continue until 628. It exhausted both empires and transformed the eastern Mediterranean. The murder of Maurice did not alone cause the war, but it gave Khosrow a justification and revealed Roman weakness. The emperor who had secured peace in the east was dead, and the soldiers who had overthrown him now watched the empire fight for survival on another frontier. The Balkans also suffered. Maurice's strategy had aimed to keep pressure on hostile groups beyond the Danube. His armies had achieved real progress. The frontier was not permanently secured, and Roman control remained uneven, but the empire had regained initiative. The rebellion destroyed the political conditions necessary to continue that strategy. Phocas depended on the army that had refused winter operations. He could not simply send the same men back north under the same policy. Troops were needed for internal security in the Persian War. Command structures changed. The state's attention shifted. Slav groups and Avar power again threatened Roman territory. Over the following decades, imperial control in much of the Balkans weakened dramatically. It would be too simple to say that one mutiny caused every later loss. Demographic change, repeated invasions, civil war, and the Eastern conflict all contributed. Yet the timing remains tragic. Maurice fell when his Balkan policy appeared close to achieving important results. He had asked for one more campaign because he believed pressure might secure the frontier. The soldiers rebelled because they believed one more campaign might destroy them. Both perceptions contained truth. The empire needed continued operations. The army needed rest and trust. Maurice could not reconcile those needs, and the frontier paid the price. Why did the soldiers hate Peter's command so intensely? The answer cannot be reduced to cowardice. These were men who had fought repeatedly. Many had crossed the Danube before. They understood danger. Their refusal came from the belief that the emperor had broken the normal expectations of service. A campaign should have a season. Pay should be reliable. Equipment allowances should not be manipulated. Horses should be preserved. Successful soldiers should enjoy their booty. Commanders should listen when conditions became impossible. Maurice's order threatened each expectation at once. It also arrived through a commander the army did not trust. Peter's family loyalty made compromise difficult. Other unpopular generals, including Commentiolus, had remained protected by the emperor despite criticism from troops. The pattern suggested that complaints from below did not matter. Soldiers therefore saw no institutional path for relief. They could obey, suffer, and perhaps die, or refuse and risk punishment. Rebellion became the third option. The army's fears may also have included longer-term changes in military settlement and recruitment. Maurice considered moving Armenian soldiers and families into Balkan regions. Such policies could strengthen the frontier, but existing troops might fear competition for land, status, and hereditary privileges. Evidence for this motive is less direct, yet it fits the wider atmosphere of suspicion. The emperor appeared ready to reorganize military society without securing the consent of those already serving. For men who believed their position was threatened, the winter order could seem like part of a larger plan to use them, weaken them, and eventually replace them. The role of communication was decisive. Maurice may have expected the army to understand that winter operations were necessary, but emperors rarely spoke directly to ordinary soldiers. Orders passed through officials, commanders, and written instructions. Each layer changed the message. A complex strategic calculation became a simple command: remain beyond the river. The soldiers did not hear a detailed explanation of the Avars' weakness, the seasonal vulnerability of Slav settlements, or the opportunity to secure the frontier. They heard that there would be no winter quarters. Because the government had previously attempted to reduce military costs, they supplied their own explanation. The emperor wanted them to live from enemy territory so the treasury would not have to support them. Once that interpretation spread, every hardship confirmed it. Cold became proof of imperial greed. Short supplies became proof that the palace did not care. Peter's refusal to compromise became proof that Maurice valued obedience over survival. A ruler can survive unpopular policy if people trust his motives. Maurice had lost that trust. This distinction explains why the strategic quality of the order could not save it. The army did not rebel because every soldier had studied the plan and found it tactically unsound. It rebelled because the command arrived inside a broken political relationship. Maurice also misunderstood the importance of public generosity. Roman emperors were expected to display abundance even when the treasury was strained. Ceremonies, gifts, games, distributions, and military payments demonstrated power. Generosity did not only purchase popularity, it reassured subjects that the emperor possessed enough resources to protect the state. Maurice's thrift could therefore create the opposite impression. Instead of appearing responsible, he appeared weak or selfish. Tiberius II had spent heavily in one affection. Maurice inherited the financial consequences, but not the emotional loyalty. When he cut expenditure, people compared his severity with his predecessor's generosity. The contrast damaged him. In Constantinople, hunger made economy look cruel. In the army, controlled pay made discipline look exploitative. Maurice may have believed that long-term survival required resisting demands he could not afford. Politically, however, an emperor who refuses immediate expectations can lose the authority needed to achieve long-term goals. His fall illustrates a recurring problem of government. Fiscal responsibility is invisible when it succeeds. People see only the benefits not received. When it fails politically, the state loses both money and stability. The soldiers' first search for a dynastic replacement reveals that they still understood legitimacy. They did not immediately reject the imperial system. They wanted a new emperor who would recognize their grievances. Theodosius offered continuity. As Maurice's eldest son, he could inherit without destroying the dynasty. The army might claim that it opposed a policy, not the Roman order itself. Germanus offered elite connections and perhaps support in the capital. These possibilities failed because mistrust spread on every side. Maurice feared that his son or son-in-law might cooperate with the rebels. Potential candidates feared that accepting support would expose them to execution if the emperor survived. The rebels feared that an aristocratic compromise would leave them unprotected. Phocas benefited from this failure. He was not the most legitimate candidate. He was the candidate whose survival depended most completely on the army. In revolutionary moments, dependence can be more valuable than prestige. The soldiers did not need a ruler who looked impressive to senators. They needed one who could not abandon them after victory. Phocas appeared to provide that guarantee. Once acclaimed, however, he faced the same imperial realities that had destroyed Maurice. The army had chosen loyalty to itself over dynastic legitimacy. The empire would spend the next years paying the cost. The participation of Constantinople's population complicates the story further. Maurice was not removed only by frontier soldiers. Urban anger mattered. The blues and greens could mobilize crowds, spread messages, and attach themselves to rival political figures. Their behavior during the crisis was not completely consistent. Alliances changed as people calculated which candidate might win. This uncertainty weakened the emperor. Maurice could not depend on a united civic body. The capital's residents had their own grievances, especially food shortages and fiscal pressure. Some welcomed Phocas as a liberator. Public acclamation gave the military coup a civilian appearance. Yet crowds are often loyal to expectations rather than individuals. When Phocas failed to provide stability, support could disappear. The same city that rejected Maurice would later witness the overthrow and execution of Phocas. Political violence did not restore a stable relationship between ruler and population. It taught each faction that emperors could be made and unmade through force. The death of Maurice also changed the meaning of military rebellion in the Roman world. Armies had elevated emperors before. Late Roman history contained many coups, usurpations, and civil wars. Yet Maurice's fall was especially important because it ended a relatively stable dynasty and opened an era of extreme external pressure. The soldiers who marched behind Phocas may have believed they were correcting an unjust policy. They could not foresee the Persian invasions, the later civil war, or the loss of Balkan control. Historical consequences often exceed intention. A man refuses an order because he wants winter rest. A commander becomes spokesman because he wants to protect his unit. A city faction supports a challenger because it wants food. Together, these limited aims destroy a government. No single participant needs to desire the final catastrophe. Collective action produces it. This is why the rebellion cannot be explained through the personality of Phocas alone. Even if he was ambitious, he did not invent the army's exhaustion or the capital's hunger. He became emperor because different crises converged at the same moment. Maurice's personal tragedy lies in the gap between achievement and perception. He had secured peace with Persia under favorable conditions. He had redirected resources toward the Balkans. His commanders had carried Roman power beyond the Danube. He may have believed that another winter of pressure would complete years of work. From the palace, the order was the logical conclusion of a successful strategy. From the camp, it was the final insult of an emperor who had repeatedly asked soldiers to bear the cost of imperial survival. Both views were shaped by experience. Maurice saw budgets, maps, reports, and long-term threats. The soldiers saw worn boots, thin horses, damaged armor, unpaid expectations, and the faces of men who had died. A functioning state must connect these perspectives. Maurice failed to do so. His commanders did not translate strategy into trust. His financial reforms were not balanced by visible concern. His earlier concessions had taught soldiers that resistance worked. When he finally insisted on obedience, the army no longer believed he deserved it. The execution at Chalcedon became the final proof, for later generations, that the rebellion had crossed from grievance into evil. Maurice could be criticized for thrift, rigidity, and political misjudgment. His sons had not issued the winter order. Their deaths revealed that the new regime was not merely correcting policy, it was eliminating every possible rival. The emotional force of a father watching his children die allowed chroniclers to transform Maurice from unpopular ruler into tragic martyr. That transformation should be examined critically, but it also reflects a genuine moral shock. Ancient political culture often accepted the killing of defeated rulers as a necessity. The murder of children still carried a particular horror. Phocas gained security in the immediate moment, but damaged his legitimacy. Every execution suggested fear. Every purge created new enemies. The emperor who had risen as the army's representative became dependent on coercion. Maurice's memory, once associated with parsimony, became increasingly associated with lawful rule and undeserved suffering. Death altered reputation in a way political success had not. Khosrow too used that memory for his own purposes. He claimed to avenge the man who had restored him to the Persian throne. Persian propaganda could present the invasion as a response to illegitimate murder. There were even claimants who said they were Theodosius, Maurice's surviving son. Whether Khosrow believed such figures or merely used them, the claim provided a convenient language of intervention. The war rapidly expanded. Roman defenses weakened under internal division. Persian forces captured important cities and advanced through territories that had seemed secure. After Heraclius overthrew Phocas, the conflict continued and became a struggle for the survival of the empire. Jerusalem fell, Egypt was lost temporarily, Persian armies reached deep into Roman lands. Heraclius eventually reversed the war through extraordinary campaigns, but the cost was immense. Both empires emerged exhausted. Soon afterward, Arab armies transformed the region. The Mutiny of 602 was only one cause among many, yet it marked the beginning of this chain of disaster. An army that refused to winter beyond the Danube could not know that its rebellion would help ignite a war lasting a generation. Modern observers may ask whether Maurice could have prevented the revolt. Several opportunities existed. He could have abandoned the winter order. He could have chosen a more trusted commander. Peter could have negotiated as Priscus had done. The government could have offered additional pay, guaranteed supplies, protected booty, or limited the duration of the campaign. Maurice could have addressed the army directly through a respected envoy. He could have publicly punished unpopular officials or acknowledged earlier grievances. In Constantinople, he might have responded more effectively to food shortages and factional anger. None of these actions guaranteed success, but they show that the rebellion was not inevitable. It resulted from decisions. Maurice chose strategic pressure over political compromise. Peter chose obedience over negotiation. Soldiers chose collective disobedience. Elites chose intrigue. Urban factions chose opportunity. Phocas chose to accept the throne. The new government chose to kill the dynasty. Each choice narrowed the path back to peace. It is also possible to imagine the soldiers' fear of punishment after the mutiny began. Roman military discipline could be severe. Rebellion threatened the entire command structure. If the army returned peacefully, leaders might be executed and units dispersed. Officers who had lost authority would demand restoration. Maurice's previous reputation gave the rebels little reason to expect generous forgiveness. The men therefore became trapped by their own action. Every day of resistance increased the danger of surrender. Acclaiming a new emperor offered legal protection. If Phocas became legitimate, the mutiny would no longer be mutiny. It would become service to the new ruler. This transformation from criminal disobedience to political revolution explains the speed with which the army embraced an imperial candidate. The soldiers did not necessarily begin with ambition to rule the empire. They discovered that only regime change could erase their crime. The rebellion's original grievances were practical. Winter, horses, food, equipment, leave, and trust. These subjects may seem small beside imperial politics, but empires often collapse through practical failures. Soldiers do not live inside strategic maps. They live in bodies that become cold and hungry. They depend on animals that weaken. They carry loads, endure wounds, and worry about families. A government that ignores these realities can possess brilliant plans and still fail. Maurice's mistake was not asking soldiers to suffer. Every empire asks that of armies. His mistake was asking them to suffer after the political bond that made sacrifice meaningful had broken. The men no longer believed the emperor shared their burden. Without that belief, discipline became coercion. The title emperor suggested universal power, but Maurice's final days exposed how fragile that power was. He had laws, ceremonies, palaces, officials, and a dynasty. Yet when the army refused orders and the capital withdrew support, these structures dissolved. He crossed the Bosporus not as the ruler of the Roman world, but as a fugitive father trying to save his children. Phocas entered the same city in triumph because people agreed, for a brief moment, to treat him as emperor. Imperial authority was therefore both institutional and theatrical. Acclamation, clothing, procession, and public acceptance turned a centurion into a monarch. Capture, removal of symbols, and display of a severed head turned a monarch into a defeated criminal. The coup demonstrated that Roman political order depended on collective belief. Once that belief shifted, 20 years of rule could vanish in days. The final judgment on Maurice must remain balanced. He was not simply a greedy tyrant. He inherited a difficult financial situation and defended an empire under pressure on several fronts. He achieved important military and diplomatic successes. His winter strategy may have been rational. He did not order the campaign merely because he hated soldiers. Yet he was politically inflexible, and his reputation for parsimony was not an accident. He repeatedly attempted to control military costs in ways that angered troops. He protected commanders the army disliked. He failed to communicate purpose or create trust. He underestimated how much resentment had accumulated. When the final protest began, he could not find a compromise before it became a revolution. Phocas, meanwhile, was not necessarily the sole architect of the crisis. He emerged from a movement already in progress. But once he accepted the throne, he became responsible for the choices of the new regime, especially the execution of Maurice's family. Later, propaganda may have exaggerated his personal depravity, yet the dynasty's destruction was real. So why did the Eastern Roman army rebel against Emperor Maurice? It rebelled because exhaustion, financial resentment, strategic pressure, and political weakness converged. The soldiers had endured years of campaigning. They remembered attempts to reduce or control their compensation. They feared for their horses, supplies, booty, and winter rest. They distrusted Peter and believed Maurice protected commanders rather than soldiers. The order to remain north of the Danube confirmed their worst interpretation of the emperor's character. When Peter refused to negotiate, protest became mutiny. Once open disobedience exposed the leaders to punishment, the army sought a new emperor. At the same time, famine, factional conflict, and elite rivalry had weakened Constantinople. The rebels marched toward a capital already prepared to abandon Maurice. Phocas became the candidate because he depended on the soldiers and promised a break with the old regime. The coup succeeded because the relationship between emperor, army, and city had already collapsed. Maurice did not fall because he knew nothing about war. He fell because he understood strategy better than resentment. His order may have offered the best chance to strike the Slavs and secure the Danube, but the men expected to carry it out no longer trusted the purpose behind his command. They heard not a plan for victory, but another demand from a ruler who had repeatedly asked them to do more with less. The mutiny began as a protest over the conditions of military service. It became a rebellion when negotiation failed. It became a coup when political factions recognized an opportunity. It became a massacre when Phocas concluded that Maurice and his sons could not be allowed to live. And it became an imperial catastrophe when Persia invaded, the Balkans weakened, and the Roman state entered decades of war. The Winter Order did not create all of these forces. It revealed them. It exposed the anger inside the army, the hunger inside the capital, the rivalry inside the court, and the weakness beneath imperial ceremony. On the banks of the Danube, soldiers refused to cross into hostile territory because they believed the emperor had stopped protecting them. At Chalcedon, Maurice watched the destruction of his family because the state had stopped protecting him. The same collapse of trust connected both moments. That is the deeper meaning of the rebellion of 602. An empire can survive defeat, poverty, and invasion. It cannot survive when the people who command and the people who obey no longer believe they belong to the same cause.